Imagine you are standing in a crowded village square in Poland, September 1939. The morning air is crisp, but the silence is suddenly shattered by a sound so unnatural and piercing that it feels like the sky itself is tearing open. It isn't the low rumble of a traditional bomber or the whistle of an incoming shell. It is a mechanical, high-pitched scream that grows louder and more frantic with every passing millisecond. You look up and see a jagged black silhouette diving vertically from the clouds, looking like a vulture plummeting for the kill. This is the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. Long before the bomb hits the ground, the sound has already done its job. It has paralyzed your muscles, clouded your mind, and shattered your will to fight. This was no accident of engineering. This was the Jericho Trumpet, the first time in history that sound was weaponized to break the human soul. When the German Luftwaffe was designing the Stuka, they weren't just looking for an accurate dive bomber. They were looking for a symbol of the Blitzkrieg. They wanted a weapon that announced its arrival with the herald of doom. To achieve this, engineers attached small propeller-driven sirens to the leading edges of the Stuka's fixed landing gear. These sirens were powered by the rushing wind as the plane tipped its nose over and accelerated into a near-vertical 70-degree dive. As the airspeed climbed toward 350 miles per hour, the tiny propellers spun faster and faster, generating a shrieking wail that could be heard from miles. It was designed to trigger a primal fear response in the lizard brain of every soldier on the ground. It told them one simple, terrifying truth: the eye of death is looking directly at you, and there is nowhere left to hide. The psychological impact of the Stuka siren cannot be overstated. During the invasion of France in the Low Countries, veteran soldiers who had survived the horrors of the Great War were found huddled in the bottom of trenches, weeping and clutching their ears, completely unable to function. The siren created a conditioning effect. After the first few raids, the mere sound of a distant whistle would cause entire units to scatter in panic, even if the planes weren't carrying bombs. It was a masterpiece of terror. The Germans realized that if you could destroy a soldier's mind, you didn't need to waste 1,000 bullets to destroy his body. The Stuka became the angel of death for the Nazi war machine, clearing the path for the Panzer divisions by turning organized defenses into a chaotic mess of fleeing, traumatized men. But the Stuka was more than just a noisemaker. It was a surgical instrument of destruction. Most bombers of the era flew high and level, dropping their payloads and hoping the wind would carry them to the target. The Stuka was different. It was built to dive. A Stuka pilot would fly directly over his target, flip the aircraft onto its back, and pull into a vertical drop. At this moment, the pilot was staring through his floor window directly at the roof of a tank or the center of a bridge. As the scream of the Jericho Trumpet reached its peak, the pilot would release the bomb at the last possible second, ensuring terrifying accuracy. But the physical toll on the pilot was just as extreme as the psychological toll on the enemy. The G-forces felt during the pullout were so intense, up to 6 Gs, that the pilots would frequently black out, their vision turning to gray, then total darkness as the blood was drained from their brains. To prevent these screaming vultures from simply crashing into the earth after a successful hit, the Stuka was equipped with one of the world's first automatic recovery systems. Even if the pilot was unconscious and slumped over the controls, the plane's Abfanggerät, or automatic dive recovery system, would kick in, pulling the nose up and leveling the wings until the pilot woke up. This combination of high-tech engineering and low-tech psychological warfare made the Stuka the most feared sight in the European sky during the early years of World War II. It was the weapon that proved that in modern war, the battle is won in the mind long before it is won on the map. This was the era of the scream, the era of the Stuka, and for the people of Europe, it felt like a nightmare from which they would never wake up. At this moment, the pilot was staring through a small glass window in the floor of the cockpit, watching his target grow from a tiny speck into a massive, unavoidable. As the scream of the Jericho trumpet reached its bone-chilling peak, the airspeed indicator would redline, and the airframe would begin to groan under the sheer pressure of the descent. The Stuka was designed with massive dive brakes, large metal slats under the wings that acted like parachutes in the air. Without them, the plane would accelerate so fast it would shed its wings or send rainbows at the wind. These brakes held the aircraft at a steady, manageable speed, allowing the pilot to aim his entire aircraft like a giant, flying sniper rifle. As the target filled the crosshairs, the pilot would release the bomb. But dropping a 500-kilogram explosive while diving vertically creates a deadly problem. Engineers created a crank or U-shaped arm called a bomb trapeze. Upon release, this arm would swing the bomb downward and forward, physically throwing it clear of the propeller blades. It was a mechanical ballet performed in the middle of a chaotic, screaming descent. But as the bomb went down, the pilot's nightmare truly began. The physical toll of pulling out of a vertical dive at 300 miles per hour is something the human body was never meant to endure. As the pilot pulled back on the stick to level out, gravity would take hold with a vengeance. The G-forces would spike to 6 Gs, meaning the pilot's body suddenly felt 6 times heavier than normal. The blood would be violently drained from the brain and forced into the legs. First, their vision would lose all color, turning into a grainy gray. Then the peripheral vision would vanish, creating a terrifying tunnel effect. Finally, total darkness. Most Stuka pilots would black out completely at the most critical moment of the flight, the pullout. To prevent these screaming vultures from simply crashing into the earth while the pilot was unconscious, the Stuka was equipped with one of the world's first automatic recovery systems. This Abfanggerät was the plane's mechanical brain. Once the bomb was released, the system would automatically adjust the trim tabs on the tail, forcing the nose of the aircraft upward. While the pilot sat slumped and lifeless in his seat, the plane would fly itself, fighting against the crushing gravity until it leveled off at a safe altitude. Only then, as the blood returned to his head, would the pilot wake up to see the massive explosion he had just created in his rearview mirror. But the Stuka had a fatal flaw that the Allies were beginning to notice. While it was the king of the dive, it was a peasant in a dogfight. Because of its fixed landing gear and heavy armor, it was slow, clunky, and defenseless against faster fighters like the British Spitfire or the Hawker Hurricane. The very sirens that terrified the infantry acted as a dinner bell for Allied pilots, telling them exactly where the Stuka was. In the Battle of Britain, the whistling death of the East found itself becoming the prey. The Luftwaffe was losing Stukas at such an alarming rate that they were eventually pulled from the front lines of the West. The era of the Siren was beginning to fade. But on the Eastern Front, one man was about to take this obsolete plane and do the impossible.
By 1943, the scream of the Stuka was no longer a sound of victory. It was a dinner bell for Allied pilots. The jumper's Ju-87 had become a flying coffin, too slow to run and too heavy to outturn the nimble Spitfires and Yaks closing in. Yet on the Eastern Front, one man named Hans-Ulrich Rudel transformed this obsolete screaming vulture into a tank-killing god. Rudel flew over 2,500 combat missions, destroying 519 Soviet tanks and even an entire battleship. He was shot down 30 times and even lost a leg, yet he refused to quit. To him, the Stuka wasn't a failure of engineering, it was a surgical tool. While other pilots were stripping the Sirens off their planes to save weight, Rudel was upgunning his aircraft with massive 37mm cannons, proving that in the hands of a master, a death trap could still dominate the battlefield. Ultimately, the famous Jericho trumpets were silenced by the cold reality of modern war. The Sirens were finally removed because their small propellers created massive drag, slowing the plane down by 20 miles per hour at a time when speed was the only way to survive. More importantly, the element of surprise was gone. The sound that once paralyzed soldiers now acted as a GPS for anti-aircraft gunners, telling them exactly where to aim before the plane was even visible. The Stuka remains a polarizing icon, a perfect dive bomber, but a disastrous fighter. It was the ultimate psychological weapon that eventually became a victim of its own fame. When the last Siren was unscrewed and thrown into the scrap heap, the skies grew quieter, but the memory of that haunting scream remains burned into history as the sound that almost broke the world.